It was supposed to take 1 hour. Instead, it rewrote American foreign policy for a generation. At 3:42 p.m. on the 3rd of October, 1993, the city of Mogadishu exploded into fire and steel. A single rocket-propelled grenade arced upward and found the tail rotor of a hovering Black Hawk helicopter. Within seconds, the aircraft Super 61 spun uncontrollably and fell from the sky. Its shattered frame crashed into the narrow streets of Somalia's capital, and with it, so too did America's faith in the precision and power of its military might. The images that followed mutilated American bodies dragged through the dirt, a pilot captured and paraded. The hollow-eyed silence of survivors would forever stain the American conscience. The world saw not a peacekeeping force, but an empire undone by a street mob armed with Kalashnikovs and rage. But how did it come to this? Why did the most advanced military on Earth find itself overwhelmed in a city it thought it could tame? And why, over 3 decades later, does this one mission still haunt the halls of Washington, whispering caution into every foreign intervention that followed? The story of Mogadishu is not merely about a failed mission. It is about hubris, about misreading a people, and about what happens when power walks blindly into a maze of history it does not understand. The 3rd of October, 1993. A local informant tipped off American intelligence that 2 senior figures in ID'd circle were meeting at a house near the Olympic Hotel, deep inside the Bakara Market District, one of the most volatile parts of Mogadishu. General William Garrison, commanding Task Force Ranger, gave the green light. Codename, Irene. At 3:32 p.m., 8 MH-60 Black Hawks and 4 AH-6 Little Birds lifted off from the airfield. Below, a convoy of Humvees and flatbed trucks rolled toward the city. The sky darkened with rotor wash. American boots hit the ground. Delta operators stormed the target building. Within minutes, the targets were in custody. But then, the chaos began. On one of the helicopters, Private First Class Todd Blackburn, only 18 years old, missed the rope and fell over 70 feet to the ground. He was severely injured. As medics scrambled to evacuate him, the convoy below began taking fire from Somali militia. Mogadishu was waking up, and it was angry. Militiamen, armed with Kalashnikovs, RPGs, and heavy machine guns mounted on Toyota pickups known as technicals, flooded into the streets. Civilians joined them, blurring the line between bystander and combatant. American troops soon found themselves in a crossfire, with no clear front, no rear, and no exit. At 4:20 p.m., the first Black Hawk Super 61 was hit by an RPG. It spun violently, crashed into an alley, and burst into flames. Both pilots, Cliff Wolcott and Donovan Briley, were killed instantly. The mission had just transformed. It was no longer about capturing targets. Now, it was about surviving. As Ranger teams scrambled toward the crash site, Chalk 2, a fire team led by Staff Sergeant Daniel Bush and Sergeant Jim Smith, arrived on foot. They set up a defensive perimeter. Bush was shot and killed. Smith was eventually rescued, wounded. Then, another Black Hawk, Super 64, piloted by Michael Durant, was hit. It too went down. This time, however, there would be no quick rescue. Durant survived the crash, but his crew was killed. 2 Delta snipers, Gary Gordon and Randy Schuhart, pleaded for permission to defend the site. After multiple denials, their request was granted. They inserted alone, 2 men, against hundreds. They fought until their ammunition was gone. They died where they stood. Durant was beaten and captured by the mob. He would survive. They would not. The streets of Mogadishu now echoed with gunfire, screams, and confusion. The convoy meant to extract the men had become disoriented, blocked by barricades, ambushed at intersections. One by one, the city swallowed them. As the African sun dipped below the minarets and the jagged silhouettes of concrete buildings, the fire did not cease. In fact, it grew. The night in Mogadishu on the 3rd of October was not a respite from battle. It was a descent into something darker, more primal. What had begun as a coordinated extraction had unraveled into a desperate struggle for survival, block by block. With both Black Hawks down, American troops scattered across unfamiliar terrain, and commands struggling to re-establish communications with its ground units, the entire battlefield dissolved into chaos. Chalks 1 and 3, their objectives now irrelevant, were redirected toward the first crash site. The plan: link up with survivors and defend until reinforced. But linking up in a city like Mogadishu, a city where every rooftop bristled with shadows and every alley concealed death, was no simple task. Delta and Ranger units advanced through 6 blocks of ruined cityscape under relentless small arms, fire, and bursts of RPGs. Each intersection became a gauntlet. Each movement was calculated not in meters, but in lives. By 5:30 p.m., the streets had grown darker, not just from the sun's retreat, but from the smoke of burning vehicles and shattered buildings. The air was thick, with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. At the first crash site, the defenders were running low on ammunition. Some began scavenging from the dead. Others waited for resupply helicopters that circled above, trying to locate openings to drop crates without being shot from the sky. Still, the Americans held. Meanwhile, Durant, the lone survivor of Super 6-4, was being paraded through the streets. Battered and bleeding, he was dragged from the wreckage and delivered to Adid's forces. The mob had stripped the bodies of his crew, tied them to vehicles, and dragged them through Mogadishu's streets, a grotesque spectacle that would soon be broadcast across the world. American television audiences watched in horror, and the White House shuddered. At the second crash site, snipers from a circling Little Bird helicopter continued to rain down, covering fire, even as the streets below grew more crowded. The militia had learned they used children as shields, civilians as camouflage. They fought dirty, and they fought smart. By now, the convoy had long since broken apart. The main element, led by Sergeant First Class Jeff Strucker, had tried to make its way to the original extraction zone, but got turned around amid barricades and gunfire. Vehicles were disabled. Gunners shot off their mounts. Chaos reigned. And still, the Americans fought on. By nightfall, it was clear. This was no longer an operation. This was a siege. Inside the command center at the airfield, General Garrison understood the implications. His best men, the most elite soldiers in the world, were pinned down. He needed help. But from whom? The United Nations Quick Reaction Force, comprised of Malaysian, Pakistani, and other coalition troops, had remained mostly in reserve. Now, they were called upon. At 11 p.m., a convoy of UN vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and trucks began to form at the southern port of Mogadishu. They were to move through contested zones, fight through barricades, and reach the crash sites. Leading the Malaysian detachment was Corporal Mat Asnin Awang. His APC was the spearhead, but halfway through the journey, his vehicle was struck directly by an RPG. He was killed instantly, the first Malaysian to die in the operation. 7 others in the column, Malaysian and Pakistani, were wounded before the convoy had even reached the battlefield. Meanwhile, back at Crash Site 1, the Americans had now been under siege for over 12 hours. Their ammunition was dwindling. Medical supplies were gone. Several soldiers lay bleeding, including Corporal Jamie Smith, who would die from blood loss during the night. The remaining Delta and Ranger operators had dug in, creating makeshift fortifications from debris and sandbags. Every few minutes, gunfire erupted, but they held on for dawn. And dawn came. At approximately 5:45 a.m. on the 4th of October, 1993, the rescue force finally broke through. UN tanks, Malaysian APCs, and Pakistani troops reached the crash site and began extracting the wounded. American soldiers, dazed and bloodied, stumbled from the shadows and into the armored vehicles. But there wasn't enough room for all. The wounded were prioritized. The rest, the still-standing Rangers and Delta men from Chalks 1 and 3, were told they'd have to make it out on foot. And so began one of the most iconic moments in modern American military history, the Mogadishu Mile. Under cover of UN armor and suppressive fire, a column of exhausted, dust-covered soldiers began jogging through the streets, weapons slung low, faces blank, some barefoot retreating from a battlefield they had never expected to walk out of. They had come for a 1-hour raid. They were leaving after 15 hours of non-stop combat. By sunrise on the 4th of October, the blood had not yet dried on the streets of Mogadishu. Burnt metal still hissed. And in the alleys of the Bakara market, bullet casings blanketed the dirt like confetti from a celebration of death. The final tally was staggering. 18 American soldiers killed, over 70 wounded. One pilot captured. 2 elite Delta Force operators posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The cost to the Somali people? Far greater, and far harder to count. Estimates suggest hundreds of Somali casualties, many of them civilians. Some were shot in crossfire. Others were deliberately used as human shields by militia. And still others, young men with rifles and rage, died believing they were protecting their homes. Yet the most powerful weapon in this battle was not an RPG. It was a camera. CNN footage of American corpses being dragged through the dirt broadcast unfiltered into millions of homes shattered the illusion of invincibility. The world didn't see a noble mission gone awry. They saw humiliation. For the United States, this was not just a battlefield defeat. It was a strategic trauma. The most powerful nation on Earth had been brought to its knees, not by a rival superpower, but by a militia without uniforms or tanks. In Washington, blame fell like rain. Secretary of Defense Leah Spen resigned before the year's end. General Garrison, though taking personal responsibility, was never formally punished. President Bill Clinton, under enormous public and political pressure, ordered a complete withdrawal of American troops from Somalia. By March 1994, the mission was over. And Somalia? It collapsed once more into warlordism. Aidid, the man at the center of it all, declared himself president and was later killed in battle. No stable government would emerge for over 2 decades. But the effects of that October day in 1993 would echo far beyond Somalia's borders. In the years that followed, every future conflict carried the shadow of Mogadishu. When Rwanda descended into genocide in 1994 with nearly 800,000 people slaughtered in 100 days, the United States did nothing. Policy advisors cited Black Hawk Down as the reason. They feared another humiliating entanglement, another body dragged through another street. When the Balkans boiled, when Sudan burned, when Liberia pleaded, the ghost of Mogadishu whispered, "Don't get involved." Even Osama bin Laden, in interviews, cited the Battle of Mogadishu as evidence of American weakness. In his view, the United States lacked the stomach for sustained war, that a few casualties could break a superpower's resolve, and, in a way, he was right. Not about America's strength, but about its fracture. Mogadishu forced a reckoning. What was the cost of being a global policeman? Where did humanitarianism end and empire begin? The battle had exposed more than a tactical failure. It revealed a moral dilemma and a strategic blindness. Washington had tried to impose order on a society it barely understood, relying on firepower and precision raids, but it had misread the terrain, underestimated the enemy, and misunderstood the culture. It assumed that decapitation removing a few militia leaders would collapse a movement. Instead, it galvanized it, and the world, once eager for American leadership, now looked on with suspicion. Allies hesitated. Rivals took notes. Mogadishu had taught a lesson, one not found in military manuals, but in the graveyards of the fallen. A war unwatched is not a war unfought, but a war misunderstood is one unwinnable. In the years since, military analysts, historians, and political scientists have dissected the Battle of Mogadishu with scalpel precision, and yet, the core miscalculation remains painfully simple. The United States believed it was fighting a mission. Somalis knew they were fighting a war. Operation Gothic Serpent was designed with surgical efficiency, capture targets, evacuate, and leave before the city could react. It assumed overwhelming speed and dominance would neuter resistance. But Mogadishu was not a city that waited. It was alive. It pulsed with memory of colonialism, of betrayal, of invasion. Its neighborhoods were mazes built not just from cement, but from generational grievance. As American troops descended from the sky, Somali militia mobilized almost instinctively. They didn't need orders. They didn't need strategy. They needed only rage and Kalashnikovs. The second fatal flaw was cultural blindness. To the planners in the Pentagon, Somali clans were a complication irrelevant to the broader objective. But in Somalia, clan loyalty defines life and death. Aidid's power didn't come from titles or military formations. It came from his blood ties, from the elders he protected, and from the foreign invaders he opposed. When previous raids by UN and US forces killed respected clan leaders and civilians, Aidid's narrative was confirmed. The Americans were not peacekeepers, they were colonizers in camouflage. Every door kicked in. Every woman screamed at gunpoint. Every elder shot accidentally. Became a recruitment poster. Then there were operational decisions questionable at best. General Garrison had requested M1 Abrams tanks and AC-130 gunships, but the Pentagon denied them. The optics, it was argued, would be too aggressive for a peacekeeping mission. The result? Lightly armored Humvees patrolled streets better suited for armor columns. Delta Force and Rangers fought valiantly. No one questions their bravery. But they were sent into a city with poor maps, outdated intelligence, and minimal local support. They spoke no Somali. They had no reliable allies on the ground. And worst of all, no plan for what to do if something went wrong. When the first Black Hawk went down, the mission spiraled not because of poor tactics, but because no one had imagined the mission failing at all. Amid the chaos, there were glimmers of something else. Something transcendent. The sacrifice of Gary Gordon and Randy Schuhart knowingly inserting themselves into an unwinnable firefight to protect a downed pilot stands as one of the most harrowing acts of valor in modern U.S. military history. They were outnumbered at least 50-1. They fought until their ammunition was gone. Their bodies were found at the base of the helicopter they defended, weapons empty, surrounded by brass. They were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, but many others received no ceremony. No parades. No headlines. Jamie Smith, bleeding to death while calling out for a medic in the dark. Cliff Wolcott and Donovan Briley, burning in their cockpit. The unnamed Rangers who dragged friends across alleys under sniper fire. Or who walked the Mogadishu Mile with shrapnel in their legs. And then, there were the Somalis. Civilians caught in the crossfire. Children hiding behind crates. Mothers who would find their sons' bodies only by sunrise and bury them without names. Their pain was rarely televised. Their voices never aired. Long after the bodies were buried and the helicopters dismantled, Mogadishu remained. Not just as a place, but as a symbol raw, complicated, and unresolved. For the soldiers who survived, the trauma was not left behind on Somali soil. It came home with them. In dreams, in silence, in the sudden noise of a car backfiring, in the awkward pauses during family dinners when someone asked, "So what happened over there?" Some returned to civilian life, others remained in service, but none were untouched. They had watched friends die. They had seen American exceptionalism meet the hard wall of reality. They had fought valiantly, but in a fight that lacked meaning, or strategy, or an endgame. The Battle of Mogadishu didn't just shatter bodies. It shattered faith in leadership, in policy, in the clean narratives that usually define American military heroism. This was no day, no Incheon landing, no triumphant banner waving over a capital. This was something murkier, something harder to explain to a public raised on victory. And yet in that murkiness lies its power, because Mogadishu became a mirror for the United States, to see not just what it could do, but what it should do, and more importantly, what it shouldn't. In the years following, the Pentagon revised its approach to urban warfare. Tactical doctrine was rewritten. Rules of engagement were redefined. Cultural training for troops was expanded. And when America invaded Iraq in 2003, the specter of Mogadishu hovered over every decision. Perhaps that is the legacy no one expected. that a failed mission in a forgotten war zone became the cautionary tale for all future engagements. In the end, the most haunting part of Mogadishu is not that it happened, but that we still do not know what it meant. Was it a humanitarian mission gone wrong? A failed imperial intervention? An act of courage swallowed by confusion? Or was it something else entirely? A flashpoint brief and brutal that exposed a fundamental flaw in how powerful nations perceive weaker ones. That you can fix a broken nation with bullets. That helicopters can land where understanding has not. The Somalis called it the Day of the Rangers. The Americans called it Black Hawk Down. But perhaps the most honest name is the warning no one heard. Because in Mogadishu, the United States did not just lose soldiers. It lost certainty. And certainty in foreign affairs is the first thing that should be questioned. Always. The Battle of Mogadishu may have taken place in the narrow streets of a fractured African capital, but its consequences spilled across the globe. For emerging powers, it was a lesson in asymmetry, the reality that even a superpower could bleed, and that low-tech tactics, used with determination and terrain familiarity, could defeat the high-tech elite. Insurgents from Iraq to Afghanistan, from Chechnya to the Philippines, studied the battle. They analyzed how Somalis use speed, numbers, and chaos to disrupt command, scatter forces, and turn urban terrain into a weapon. The RPG, once seen as a relic of the Cold War, gained new prestige. The use of civilian shields became standard practice among irregulars. And the belief that American public opinion could be swayed not by defeat, but by the image of defeat, became doctrine. Osama bin Laden himself, in a 1998 interview, referenced Mogadishu. The American soldier was dragged in the streets of Mogadishu. After a few days, Clinton withdrew his troops. It was then that I knew America is weak. But what about America's allies? Nations that once joined US-led coalitions without question began to hesitate. When Rwanda fell into genocide just months later and the world watched 800,000 die, the United States offered no military response. Clinton later admitted that fear of another Somalia stopped him. In Bosnia, in Sudan, in Haiti, every diplomatic cable, every deployment order carried one whispered phrase: "Don't let it be another Mogadishu." That small corner of Mogadishu became a geopolitical fulcrum. The day the United States blinked, and the world noticed. Amid the strategy, the consequences, and the headlines were the men on the ground. Many would write memoirs. Some would never speak of it again. Mike Durant, the downed pilot, returned home after 11 days in captivity. His body had been battered, his back fractured, but his will was unbroken. He later met the families of Gordon and Schuhart and told them what their husbands had done. Delta Force members, bound by secrecy and honor, rarely gave interviews, but those who did spoke not of glory, but of duty. Of the hours they spent holding a line they knew they would not escape. Of the fear that turned to resolve. And of the comrades who fell not in vain, but in isolation. Rangers who had walked the Mogadishu Mile carried that moment in silence. Some struggled with PTSD. Some found peace in returning to civilian life. Others re-enlisted not for revenge, but for purpose. And all of them were marked. One veteran, speaking at a memorial service years later, said quietly, "We were sent to do something good, and we did something hard. But we were not ready for what it meant. There are places in history where clarity dissolves, where victory, defeat, and purpose blur together in smoke and silence. Mogadishu is one of those places. 30 years later, the streets where Super 6-1 fell have changed, but the memories have not. There is no plaque for the civilians who died in the crossfire. No shrine for the snipers who bought their comrades minutes of life with their own. But somewhere in the dust, in the cracked buildings and bullet-pocked walls, lingers a question. What did it all mean? Was it courage wasted? Or was it the only kind of courage that matters, courage born from chaos, chosen freely by men who knew they might never return? Was it a tragedy of planning? Or of policy? Did the United States learn restraint? Or simply retreat until the next crisis, in a different country, under a different flag. The Battle of Mogadishu forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that not all sacrifice brings resolution. Sometimes it brings only memory. But memory can teach. And if it does, if we are listening, then those men who fell in Somalia did not fall into darkness. They fell into history. Empires don't always fall with an explosion. Sometimes they step back in silence. This has been Legacy Files. If you believe history still has something to say, something urgent, something real, help us keep that voice alive. Subscribe. Remember, and never stop asking what comes next.